Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before we get started with the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you are interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or another, although I usually do. The subject from this particular episode was chosen by Patricia, and I'd like to thank them for the request and for the donation. If you'd still like to help support the podcast, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, especially now since I still need to get my car fixed, and on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent, keep the lights on, fix my car. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, wherever you might listen to us on. Feel free to be honest. I don't mind. It would be nice to have higher ratings to make sure that people see the podcast and want to listen, but I value honesty, so. And as always, these sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include the book Apocalypse 1692, Empire, Slavery, and the Great Port Royal Earthquake by Ben Hughes. I also sourced from an episode of Underwater Cities about the history of Port Royal, the United States Geological Survey site about the earthquake, and JamaicaPortRoyal.com, a comprehensive website discussing Port Royal, its history, and the earthquake more specifically. The website also contains the account of survivor and Anglican pastor Emmanuel Heath, whose letters about what happened would be published in Reed's Weekly Journal in 1756. And before I start the episode, I solemnly swear that I will not attempt a Jamaican accent, because that would be wrong, and I will not attempt a pirate voice, because that would be wrong, but for far less problematic reasons. With all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 253, The 1692 Port Royal Earthquake. June 7th, 1692. Around 5,000 deceased. Every day, a pirate's life is starting to sound more and more attractive. Okay, not how they actually lived, but you know, dropping everything, getting on a ship, sailing away from all my problems on a boat, staffed by equally disheartened people looking for escape. The violence, the amputations, and the scurvy, maybe not so much. So I guess it's not a pirate's life for us. It's probably for the best. I'm not the best swimmer, and Professor would fall overboard in about 10 minutes from barking too enthusiastically at a dolphin. Until then, we'll just have to content ourselves with rewatching Our Flag Means Death and learning about one of the most devastating earthquakes in history, one which struck at the home of many pirates and privateers. Jamaica, that little island in the Caribbean which gave us jerk chicken and chocolate milk, reggae and ska music, Rastafarianism, and radial tires. East of the Yucatan, south of Cuba, west of Haiti, and north of Panama, Jamaica sits amongst the Greater Antilles Island Group in the West Indies. Its capital of Kingston is located to the southeast, tucked into a dip in the southern coastline that almost seems like just another bay if you look up Jamaica on Apple Maps, but don't zoom in too closely. But then you zoom in, and in, and in, and that's when you notice that Kingston doesn't exactly have an open view of the Atlantic to the south. See, there's this string of land which wriggles horizontally from the east, making it about 2/3 of the way across the bay to the town of Portmore, southeast of Kingston. When I say southeast of Kingston, I mean like right southeast of Kingston. You have Kingston, and there's Portmore, and then there's this little road that goes out on this tiny little strip of land. The thin, barely there peninsula leads first to Kingston's Norman Manley International Airport, which is kind of like off to the north. And then, if you keep going all the way to the end, you'll reach the tiny seaside village of Port Royal. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why does Port Royal sound so familiar? Well, if you've seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, then you know Port Royal as the home of Elizabeth Swann and William Turner at the start of the first film. It's the town in the cove with the high cliff, the buildings constructed into the sloping side of a hill. The movie filmed this in St. Vincent, and the difference between fiction and reality is apparent just from looking at a regular map. No satellite pictures or street views necessary. Port Royal is flat as a board, and seemingly has been for centuries. Centuries ago, however, Port Royal was bigger than it was today, but horizontally rather than vertically. It really is just a tiny spit of land. When you see it in pictures and satellite pictures, and you look at it, it's a tiny town on this tiny itty bitty spit of land. There's really nothing to it. As with many islands throughout the Caribbean, Jamaica was originally inhabited solely by the indigenous people of the island, the Arawak, the Taino. They were living on the islands in the Caribbean when Columbus shows up. And well, you know how it is. One tourist finds a good local place you've been keeping secret, and the next thing you know, it's overrun with tourists, and the neighborhood is getting gentrified. Columbus had claimed islands in what they would call the West Indies for Spain, but 125 years later or so, give or take, the English started snapping up islands in the Caribbean for themselves. One of those islands was Jamaica, which was taken in about like 1655, give or take. Throughout Port Royal were homes and businesses built of stone, lining the bustling streets of a busy and wealthy town. At the time, it was basically the capital, of Jamaica. Everything was being done there. Port Royal was flush with cash from its status as the place for commerce in the Caribbean, although not all of its means of making money were particularly meant for polite company. A quarter of the buildings in town were for knocking back a drink, picking up a sex worker, or both. This included sex worker Mary Carlton, who had quite the reputation for having so many clients waiting to engage her in her business that she might as well have set up a barber's numbered ticket dispenser next to the door, or butcher's, excuse me. Contrast that with the more serious folks of Port Royal, the Royal Navy members and clergymen from varying faiths, the merchants and plantation owners and politicians. Port Royal contained 5 forts, an impressive feat in a space in which every inch of land had value. When you look at it now, it's really hard to imagine how they could have squeezed 5 different military forts on what is there. But you have to keep in mind, they're squeezing 5 forts and just a bunch of different streets and businesses. The wharf side there, is busy with docks and all of that. There's just a lot going on, and it is full of people. And so Port Royal it's shaking. There's just a lot going on all the time. So you would have people who were, soldiers and Navy men, the Royal Navy, walking through the streets past sex workers and bartenders, pirates and able seamen, Quakers and Jews and Catholics. There were a lot of different types of people, with different religions. You get away from everything that's going on in England and come here instead. Port Royal being the mercantile hub that it was, one never knew quite what might be aboard the ships which arrived at the quayside on any given day. The episode of Underwater Cities that I watched shows a Japanese sword and Chinese dragon statue excavated at Port Royal, showing just how far things could travel by ship before they showed up at Port Royal. Now, if you've watched the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, obviously they go and they go to Asia, they go to East Asia, they go all over the place, and that happened a lot back then as well. So you have all of these people traveling all around, hopping from one place to another. I can't remember exactly when the first time the globe was circumnavigated, because that part of my brain is just escaping me right now. But to, have people from around the world show up in different places was not unusual at all. I don't know if any of you have heard, or all of you have heard about that fact, that there was a span of about something like, I want to say like 15 years, where a samurai could have sent a fax to Abraham Lincoln, because it was just the way that history converged that could happen. And so that was kind of the same thing with piracy. You have all these people who are traveling on ships and going from here to there and bringing treasures and all of that. So things from, Japan and China are making their way all the way over to Jamaica. Jamaica also did a thriving business in the trading and purchase of enslaved African people who might end up forced to do household duties in Port Royal or field work in the more rural areas of Jamaica. Still, it had to compete in that and so many other areas with Barbados, which did a brisk turn in buying and selling enslaved people of African descent as well. There was a lot of negotiating that went on, and a lot of, taking and there was just a lot going on in terms of the slave trade in that area in the West Indies and the Greater Antilles and all of that. So you had a lot of people of, African descent who were here because they had been brought here as part of the slave trade, and they were sort of, getting taken from one island to another to do, to work for this family or work for that family or work on this plantation or work in this home. It was very depressing. You also had indentured servants, of course, from Europe, from, Ireland, Britain, wherever, who would come over here and or be brought over here and work off their passage that way. So there were a lot of people of different stations of life all throughout Port Royal and throughout Jamaica, but especially with Port Royal, it just being this hub of just thousands of people. And there were something like I want to say like three or four streets that kind of went off like the bones in your hand for your fingers, like that branches like that, and then they went that way to the western side of town, where there was the street there that would connect them all into kind of a triangular shape. So that is what you were looking at with Port Royal at the time in 1692, and it was just constantly busy, constantly full of people who were making money, hand over fist. At any given time in those days, Port Royal could have around 6,000 to 8,000 residents, making it the largest city in the West outside of Boston. In some respects, Port Royal was an impressive and respectable town, with the island's House of Assembly meeting there, as well as the presence of the Royal Navy. There was a lot of politics that was going on in Port Royal with, the council and all of that, the president or the lead of the island and just so many things that had been going on, especially the previous few years. And I think we're all a little tired about hearing about politics right now, so I'm not even going to get into that. But at the time, there was the council in Port Royal who were meeting and making decisions on how the port was going to be run and things like that. So it was a lot of very busy people in this town. Port Royal would gain the nickname the wickedest place on earth, and close approximations thereof, and for good reason. part of that was because you don't want get as rich as some of the men growing their fortunes in Port Royal without sending a little money into the pockets of the local government. But another large part of that was because some of those men gaining their wealth and power in Port Royal were pirates. Now, back in the day, there were pirates and privateers. To put it simplistically in more modern terms, privateers were like the folks running your nearest legal dispensary, while pirates were the equivalent of Jay and Silent Bob selling joints outside the Stop and Go. Privateers worked on behalf of a government, commandeering the ships and accompanying booty from opposing nations, and were free and legal, while pirates were more of the self-employed sort and decidedly not legal. Basically, countries like England and France and Spain would hire privateers to take care, essentially, of keeping the oceans near where they were located clear of whoever was the enemy. So in this particular case, you had privateers who would be in Port Royal and worked on behalf of Jamaica and Port Royal to go after ships that were of French or Spanish origin and kind of keep them from coming into the area in a way where they might be trying to take things from Jamaica. So the English would have these privateers that they had hired, and they would go out and they would, commandeer these ships and take everything that was on them, and maybe give some to Port Royal, and this way they would be able to do their job and also get away with it, basically. Jamaica's most famous pirate was Henry Morgan, he of Captain Morgan rum fame. He who started out as a Welsh indentured servant and ended up at one point as the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Morgan was incredibly successful as a pirate, and all that pirate treasure would find its way back to Port Royal in the pockets of everyone from politicians to the barkeeps and sex workers, keeping the entertainment flowing throughout the town. It's the way things are. You make money, and then you bring it home and you spend money, so... The job as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica came after a messy excursion to Panama City approved by the colonial governor of Jamaica. Morgan and his crew shook the city down, and shook Panama City down, for a substantial windfall. But by the time they got to Jamaica, that windfall had been whittled down to a couple hundred pieces of 8, and the King of England wasn't exactly thrilled with Morgan taking from the colony of a country England was currently at peace with. However, the governor who sent Morgan and his crew to Panama City got the brunt of the punishment. Basically, Morgan and this governor end up going back to England to face what is going on, and instead of, throwing Captain Morgan into the brink and into the jail and saying, okay, that's it, we're done with you, we're not dealing with this anymore, they figured it was a lot better just to get rid of the governor and send Morgan back. And that's exactly what they did. They sent him back to Jamaica with a lieutenant governorship that put him in a position of punishment over his fellow pirates. He fell into debauchery and the bottle, and in 1688, he passed away from the ill effects of alcoholism, which makes the fact that there's now a popular rum named after him just a little bit weird. With so much absconded treasure arriving in Port Royal on a regular basis, the town's wicked reputation grew out of the unrestrained behavior of the people who lived there. One didn't go to Port Royal to attend the opera any more than a college kid attends spring break to do some light reading on the beach. There were simply too many temptations to indulge in. Drinks at the tavern, bawdy women at the brothel, and games of chance where you could find them. But the presence of pirates in Port Royal provided a bit of an opportunity for the British military and the government officials on the island. Yes, one didn't want to be living in the same neighborhood with riffraff, but neither did one want their neighborhood attacked and robbed by that same riffraff. So what you do is you keep the pirates around, you let them be, they can raid whichever Spanish or French ships come up nearby, and you let their crimes slide while you get a cut of the take. There's everybody's problems tied up in a neat little bow. At least everybody in Port Royal. The ships from Spain and France that came nearby, they had their own problems. Now, June 7th, 1692, was just as hot and dry as it had been in Port Royal for the past week. Those who got up early could see the ocean waters looking odd and glassy. According to an eyewitness account written in a pair of letters by Emmanuel Heath, Port Royal's Anglican rector, and you're going to learn one of those guys who says that, God never makes mistakes, or, this is what, God is punishing you for, like that kind of a guy. But most of 1692 had been like that, very hot and dry, a little stormy weather outside of May. Heath would describe his activities that morning as having been, quote, as church reading prayers, which I did every day since I was rector of Port Royal, to keep up some show of religion amongst a most ungodly, debauched people. Thank you so much, Reverend Heath. On that particular day, Port Royal was still waiting on a new governor. Like I said, they'd had some political things, some problems they'd had to deal with, and now they're just kind of working on getting themselves a new governor. Until then, the president of the council, John White, was the acting governor. Emmanuel Heath would be drawn away from his praying for the sinners of Port Royal, or perhaps praying as a defense against them, by the president of the council, who engaged him in conversation while enjoying a pipe of tobacco. This was a bit to the consternation of Heath, who'd had plans to go share the midday meal at the house of a Captain Rooting. Captain Rooting seems to have invited several people over that day for brunch, if you want to say that, and along with his own family was saving a seat for Heath. But Heath lingered with the acting governor, John White. He's a good friend. He's hanging out with him, just kind of, talking and chatting. I don't know if he's gossiping, but probably something along those lines. Meanwhile, ships cluttered the harbor. It's a very busy time, but they're unable to depart due to a council rule against, quote, merchantmen leaving the port unescorted, per Apocalypse 1692. This was a rule discussed and modified by the council at a meeting in town that very morning. The rule that they had was, they were going into like these precise little details on who gets to leave when and who gets to go where in regards to the ships and the boats which use the harbor. It's the kind of minute little things that like a town council handles. This is more of a bigger council than that, but it's still pretty small potatoes. At least one ship, the HMS Swan, was essentially beached at the wharf. It hadn't been crashed or anything like that, but it had been left behind while others had gone to the other side of the island to face off against a possible attack by French privateers. So the HMS Swan was at the wharf, kind of pressed up against the wharf to the point where you could see the keel. That's how close it was. Around Port Royal, people were simply going about their normal business. Many of the Quakers in town headed by boat to Spanish Town across the bay for their monthly meeting. Spanish Town was, and still is, it located just to the north of where Kingston is now located. So it's basically like straight across the bay that you're going to Spanish Town. Some were sleeping in on what looked to be a lazy Saturday morning. Still others got up and headed to the pub for a drink and some entertainment. It's just a regular Saturday. Then at 11:43 a.m., those in Port Royal could hear a sharp sound rumbling from the north, reminiscent of thunder. The way that it's described is that rumbling sound. It's coming from the top of the island, the north of the island, and it is just this growling of the earth. It soon became evident that this was no oncoming storm, at least not from the sky. Underneath the feet of the people of Port Royal, the ground shook 3 times. The first didn't seem so bad. It's just a little shake. The second was worse. Then came the third. Now, as this is going on, Emmanuel Heath is hanging out with John White, and they're talking, and then the ground starts to shake underneath them. And Emmanuel Heath, who doesn't really have the same experience with this sort of thing, says something along the lines to John White, like, what is this? What's going on? And John White, being like a lot of people in Port Royal at the time, was like, oh, it's just an earthquake. Don't even worry about it. Like, he just in this very dismissive tone said, it's an earthquake, it happens, kind of like that. But like I said, then came the third shake. A small earthquake had shook the town only 4 short years earlier. Not really like a huge one, but enough to, everybody recognized it for what it was. But it was nothing like this. This cracked the ground open in multiple places. It would open up these fissures, and it started swallowing people that were like, the first thing that you do in an earthquake for some people, you run outside. You go to an empty space because it's safer outside than in. And they would go outside and, they're going out, they're panicked, they're running in the streets. A lot of people were terrified. They had no idea what was going on. And these fissures are opening up in the street. They're starting to, bring in, buildings and horse carts and whatever else is around. And people who were running through the streets didn't see it coming, and they were falling into these fissures. There's stories of them falling in and the fissures closing on them and them getting crushed. There's stories of them falling in and getting stuck up to the waist or getting stuck up to their head and people being unable to dig them out. And there's even mention in some accounts of people who had been buried like that, like up to their head, and the dogs, being the way that dogs can be when they're maybe a little bit feral or a little bit shaken, and kind of going after the people who were stuck in the ground. So this was a thing that was happening all over the island. Almost as soon as this earthquake started, things like this, these fissures are starting to open up. Terrified people of all stripes and social standing reverted to the fearful response of a startled dog. They bolted through the streets like stampeding cattle, mindlessly searching for safety and finding none. All around Port Royal, homes and businesses constructed of stone crumbled as the tremors grew more powerful, with no foundations due to how high the water table was. I mean, we're talking about an island, basically an island, that is about 10 feet above sea level. It's only 10 feet. When you look at it now, it is low, and it's sand. It is all sand. So that is not a really good place to build this sort of a thing without some very sturdy anchoring into the ground. And these buildings didn't have that. So they start to fall apart. With these foundations not here, the buildings which made up Port Royal, they start to fall into the sea. The northern side, basically the land under Thames Street, like the Thames in London, the land under Thames Street, which was one of the northern streets, liquefied, and the entire quayside just slipped right into the harbor like a meatball rolling off someone's plate. It went so quickly. This part of the island started sinking so quickly that some of these buildings that people were in, I mean, they didn't have a chance to get out, but some of them didn't even come apart. You would think that when an earthquake is shaking these buildings and they are falling into the sea, that they would come to pieces, or the way that they do in tsunamis that we've seen images of from Japan and from Thailand in recent years. Like, you would expect that. But that's not what kind of happened here. In a lot of cases, you had these buildings where they went right into the harbor, but a lot of them were still in one piece. In fact, some of them that were tall enough were high enough that the top floor was still above water, while the rest of the building is like below the harbor. So people who were fortunate enough to be on that third floor were alive, while the people who were below them in the buildings that they were in drowned. Out of 2,000 buildings in Port Royal, less than a tenth would remain standing above water. Some even remained standing below water, like I said. Their drop into the harbor had been done just so that one could see several rooftops poking out of the water. Not moving, still attached, they were there. But the removal of this land meant the encroachment of the water from the harbor into what was left of Port Royal, spreading 500 feet from where it had stopped only minutes earlier. Manuel Heath would describe he and Council President John White bolting as the shaking brought down the steeple of St. Paul's Church where he would preach, and then the rest of the church itself. Separated in the chaos, Heath ran alone toward Morgan's fort, which he figured in the moment would be a safe place. Or I believe it was Morgan's line or Morgan's fort, something along those lines. But he went there. It's, these forts are like, have these big open areas, and he went that way. However, according to Heath, quote, "As I made toward it, I saw the earth open and swallow up a multitude of people, and the sea mounting in upon us over the fortifications," end quote. What he presumably didn't see was the home of Captain Rooting, which collapsed onto everyone at the brunch Heath was meant to attend. All but one person inside the home died as a result. There isn't a name listed. It just says, to use the terminology of the time, a Negro. But there's a lot of that too. You see a lot of mentions of, in quotes of a woman and her slave, a family and their slaves, two slaves, this and that. And it can be a little jarring sometimes to read the accounts of who passed away. But some of the people who were enslaved, who were with, they were with the families that owned them, or that sort of thing, that at the plantations, whatever, they were still trying to help the people that they could. So yeah, maybe they were helping the people who were in the family who owned them. Maybe they were helping people who were in the streets. Everybody was trying to help everybody else up to a point. Now, from the side, Port Royal and the Palisados, which is the strip of land connecting it to Jamaica, they're shaped like a heaping tablespoon of sugar, or heaping teaspoon of sugar at the time. So it's basically like this long stretch of land, this long thin stretch of land, and then this land where it's like a little rounded at the bottom, and then there is this big part at the top. But the quake knocked half of that sugar off the spoon, sinking the northern part of the island into the ocean as though someone very large yanked it down from underneath. It also snapped off the stem of that teaspoon. With the Palisados so delicate, it didn't take much to both sink the land and hide it below the growing waves. I mean, if you look at it now, that road now, it is still very close to the ocean. You can't really tell, because if you follow that on Google Street View and you just kind of go down that road, there's bushes and things on the side, and you can't really tell how close you are to the ocean for a lot of it, or how low you are. It's just basically, you're getting on that road to either drive to Port Royal or drive the other way to go to Kingston, which I'm sure a lot more people are doing. People drowned or were crushed under the weight of collapsing buildings as Port Royal became half of the town it was only moments before. One of the few small blessings came from the destruction of the forts throughout Port Royal. Oh, they were broken, to say the very least. Fort James, Carlisle, Rupert, they were all underwater. Forts Walker and Charles were on the southwestern side, which may have kept them above water, but didn't prevent them from suffering significant damage from the quake. Now, Fort Charles, if I remember correctly, there still is the one that's still kind of there. There's still remnants of it there. And it was more, like I said, southwesterly. There's kind of more of an empty space in drawings of the time of Port Royal where Fort Charles was. So that probably helped a little bit, and especially with the way that the northern part of the island took the brunt of the damage. Where Fort Charles was, that was a little safer in that regard. And so the blessing came in the form of a tower in the center of Fort Charles's courtyard. Inside that tower was Port Royal's magazine of artillery, its powder and cartridges to fight off pirates or privateers should any advance on the city. Given Port Royal's horrendous luck that day, one might be worried the magazine may explode, or at the very least be ruined by an influx of seawater. Thankfully, it remained intact. In coming days, the island's soldiers could very well need that magazine to maintain order. So it was kind of a good thing they still had that. Understandably, the quake struck not just Port Royal, but the entire island of Jamaica. Per Emmanuel Heath's reporting, quote, "The earthquake threw down almost all of the houses, churches, sugar works, mills, and bridges through the whole country. It tore the rocks and mountains and destroyed some whole plantations and threw them into the sea." End quote. Land on the northern side of the island shifted and sank, with some places cracking open like giant mouths and devouring everything from houses to people. The quake moved the island like a Rubik's Cube, twisting it around and placing the pieces differently than they'd been prior to the shake. People saw the Cobre River cut off as landslides collapsed into a dam, just an accidental dam, which blocked the river. The river then flooded nearby salt pans. The quake dumped mountains onto villages full of people and moved plantations from one place to another. It broke open the ground to spew forth water from wells in areas which had been dry as a bone previously. One place which was spared at least somewhat less was Spanish Town, which had been the capital of Jamaica on and off since the Spanish set foot on the island nearly 2 centuries earlier. The town was a display in contrasts between the two countries which had colonized the island. The Spanish had witnessed so many earthquakes over the years that they had been in charge of Jamaica, and they built their homes low to the ground and sturdier. The British, on the other hand, had dismissed the dangers of seismic activities and built taller homes. So when the earthquake hit, all of the structures in Spanish Town took at least some damage. It was a very destructive earthquake. But the ones which really held up were those short, sturdy ones constructed by the Spanish over the decades. Those were the ones that were safer and, didn't take as much damage as, the ones that were 2-3 stories tall and just, collapsed as soon as the earthquake hit. As if the earthquake's devastation was not bad enough, there was more to come. As with other earthquakes and volcanic eruptions we've covered in the podcast, the ocean waters pulled away from Port Royal. Over by Liguania, where the capital of Kingston would one day grow, the retreating water revealed the seafloor going out nearly 300 yards. There's a witness in, I believe it's Apocalypse 1692, a witness who talks about how he had a friend who was with him, and they were at Liguania, and the two of them see this water pulling out, and of course you see all these fish that have been, kind of left there by the retreating waters flopping about, and the friend went out to go get them and was probably not the only one snapping them up, and as he's grabbing them up, the water starts coming back, and at that point, you need to run. The scene would have been reminiscent of the same images of the sea retreating from tight beaches on Boxing Day in 2004, just minutes before the sea would come back toward those beaches in a furious wave. Out in the harbor, it looked as though everything but the kitchen sink had been dumped into the drink. The contents of the structures on the northern side of Port Royal, the furniture, clothes, toys, people, bobbed in the water. Survivors clung to trunks or trees or whatever else might be floating close enough to hold on to. There were ones who were holding onto the rooftops of buildings, waiting for boats to come out and get them. The bodies of the dead mingled with the living, including some whose coffins had been shaken free from a graveyard that was by the Palisados. It was down toward where Port Royal narrowed into the Palisados, and it shook up all these coffins, and they ended up in the water. Now they were being pulled away from the land. All these people, they're hanging on to these things, and the water's starting to pull away, and they're hanging on for dear life to what they can. Soon enough, they'd be pushed back toward Jamaica in the worst way possible. In Port Royal, plenty of people weren't even paying attention to the water pulling away from the land. They were distracted. They were searching for their loved ones, digging through wreckage, trying to tend to the wounded. Some survivors made their way to the Siam Merchant, a ship moored in the harbor, which took some damage. It had a pretty serious leak, but it was still working well enough to be used as a shelter for the survivors, including Emmanuel Heath. Understandably, many people did not want to stay on the island, at least not for the moment. There was still, even after the earthquake, for hours, days, weeks afterwards, you're getting aftershock, aftershock, aftershock. And the thing about these shocks is you're getting them over and over again, and you don't know if they're aftershocks or if they're foreshocks to something bigger. So, even if it was just that one, horrifying earthquake on June 7th, a lot of people were just like, nope, I'm not having it. And they went to go stay on boats in the harbor or elsewhere, or they left, or, whatever it was that they could do to deal with the situation. When the tsunami rolled back toward what was left of Port Royal, it didn't have to rise much to sweep through the town. After all, as I mentioned earlier, Port Royal is low-lying today, just 10 feet above sea level. Banda Aceh, Indonesia, which was so devastated by the Boxing Day tsunami, is 30 feet above sea level. The Maldives, which were also hit by the Boxing Day tsunami, are at most 6 feet above sea level. They're about 3 to 6 feet above sea level. By the time the tsunami on Boxing Day reached the Maldives, the waves were from 10 to 13 feet high. It was a miracle that the Maldives weren't wiped entirely off the map. So when a 6-foot wave swept towards Port Royal, it did so over a devastated, low-lying town in which people were still trapped underneath their fallen homes and businesses. You might have survived the earthquake only to drown when the sea swept over the place where you'd been buried while you were waiting for somebody to rescue you. The water inundated the town, only serving to increase the body count. So a lot of the town was swept up with this water. It was like the top half of what was left of Port Royal is just swept up in the tsunami. As one would expect, the nearby harbor was filled with ships. The displaced water from the sinking of the quayside, as well as the tsunami, carried many of the ships in the harbor, not just toward the island, but onto it. Boats floated through the streets of Port Royal, landing on top of homes or businesses, crashing into victims struggling in the water. The HMS Swan, which was the one that had been up against the wharf, ended up shoved over the tops of buildings on Thames Street until it landed on King's House and destroyed its upper floor. The King's House, if I remember correctly, is where they kind of did all their, political business, that sort of thing. It was like the governor's place, that sort of thing. In some ways, the displaced vessels were the lucky ships, as many sank when their anchors pulled them down below the Atlantic. Approximately 5,000 people would die, not just from the earthquake which struck the town of Port Royal, Jamaica on June 7th, 1692, and the ensuing tsunami, but from the sorts of medical issues which disasters like this can still lead to today when victims don't receive timely or proper care. Half followed the city into the sea or were swept away by the tsunami, while the other half died from injuries which couldn't be healed due to a lack of medical care or diseases caught from the conditions that were going on following the earthquake. You're looking at contaminated water and corpses rotting underneath fallen debris that nobody can find. There's a lot of diseases that could possibly be going on that people were catching and dying of as a part of this disaster. Amusingly, according to Emmanuel Heath's letters, one of the men who died was William Turner, Thomas Turner's brother, showing that Pirates of the Caribbean may not have gotten the geography of Port Royal right, but they stumbled into getting one of the residents' names correct, although that's a pretty common name. So not only did Port Royal and the surrounding areas of Jamaica lose thousands of inhabitants to the quake, but so too did Port Royal lose much of itself to the sea, a full 33 acres of the town itself. Diagrams of the differences in Port Royal pre- and post-earthquake show the upper half of the city sank below Atlantic waters as a result of the earthquake, with a good third of what was left washed away by the tsunami. Henry Morgan's grave disappeared under the ocean. So too did 5 of Port Royal's forts, leaving only one behind, and that was essentially Fort Charles. That was the only one that was well enough to keep going, I guess you could say. Now, for days after the June 7th quake, Jamaica would get hit with one aftershock after another. By the time it would all subside, 90% of the buildings in Port Royal had been obliterated from existence. But until then, many people didn't want to have anything to do with the constant, terrifying shaking beneath their feet, and who could blame them? They continued to stay aboard ships like the Siam Merchant, waiting to decide their next move. You stay in Jamaica, or you go to Barbados or Haiti, or wherever else, or head somewhere else where earthquakes are not. Maybe go back to England. Who knows? Emmanuel Heath, who'd soon enough run from Morgan's fort to his own home, spoke of what came immediately after the quake. Quote, I went to my balcony to view the street in which our house still stood. It was still standing, by the way, and saw never a house down there, nor the ground so much as cracked. The people seeing me cried out to me to come and pray with them. When I came into the street, everyone laid hold of my clothes and embraced me, that with their fear and kindness I was almost stifled. I at last persuaded them to kneel down and make a large ring, which they did. I prayed with them near an hour, when I was almost spent with the heat of the sun and the exercise. They then brought me a chair, the earth working all the while with new motions and tremblings like the rollings of the sea, insomuch that sometimes, when I was at prayers, I could hardly keep myself upon my knees. By that time I had been half an hour longer with them, in setting before their sins and heinous provocations, and seriously exhorting them to repentance. End quote. Which I'm sure is exactly what you want to hear when you've just been through a horrific accident and all of your friends and family are dead. Well, there's your sign to repent. He also has a quote about how there were some Jewish people who came to pray with them and were extolling the virtues of Jesus and how great, how proud he was of that, which it's not exactly a very nice quote in retrospect. But Heath was not the only holy man in Port Royal to extol the wrath of God's vengeance on this town of heathens. Given the days that followed, continued aftershocks, death everywhere you turned, a sudden vicious burst of thunderstorms, which followed the earthquake, it certainly would have given those men of God plenty of evidence that their God was unhappy, at the very least, with the darker elements of Port Royal, if not everyone there, for allowing such sin to continue. Still, Heath would say in his June 28th letter, quote, multitudes of rich men are utterly ruined, whilst many who were poor, by watching opportunities and searching the wrecked and sunk houses, even almost while the earthquake lasted, and the terror was upon all the considerable people, have gotten great riches. Heath would write that he could no longer live in Port Royal, as, quote, I must undergo great hardship if I continue here, the country being broke to pieces and settled. I must now live in a hut, eat yams, and plant tents for bread. I'm imagining plantains is what he means, which could never endure. Drink rum punch and water, which were never pleasing to me. Oh, the poor baby. He said he had sent for a younger person to replace him and was, as of his second letter on June 28th, living aboard a ship on the harbor. Yeah, his letters are really frustrating to read because they're very much about, saying that, they were hit with this earthquake because of sin, and he couldn't live here anymore, which would be understandable because, of course, it's a very difficult situation to go through a disaster like this, but it's kind of filled with asides like this where he's like, I can't live in a hut and eat yams, which right now is sounding really good to me. The bodies of the dead would be turning up all over Jamaica for days and weeks, if not months after. In Port Royal, people ended up buried under the remains of their homes if they were lucky. At least then you could be more easily be located. But with the retreating waters of the tsunami went so many of the islands dead that it would be impossible to get a set and correct death toll. It's kind of an estimation going on in terms of 5,000 deceased, 4,000 deceased, somewhere along those lines. After all, Port Royal was a pirate's haven, where people kept their identities to themselves and didn't have what one might call a permanent address. Now, after any disaster, there are going to be people who resort to, let's say, questionable behavior, as Heath noted, in a town like Port Royal, populated by many whose morals were already a mess prior to the disaster. The tragedy presented more opportunities to violate the law. Robbers and vandals snipped off the fingers of the deceased to more easily take their jewels. Looters rifled through the rubble to steal and even dove into the sunken sections of the city looking for treasure. Port Royal was for many a repository for free stuff whose owners were now long gone, or just not there, dead. As long as you could ignore the fact that they might be dead somewhere in the building, you could go in and take whatever you wanted. But if the vengeance of God was not that much of a threat, the vengeance of the island might well have done far more to scare survivors into shaping up. According to Heath, here we go again, quote, "Thus I have told you a long and sad story, and God knows what worse may happen yet. The people tell me that they hear great bellowings and noises in the mountains, which makes some very apprehensive of an eruption of fire. If so, it will, I fear, be more destructive than the earthquake. The quake and tsunami were bad enough. A volcanic eruption would have been the destructive cherry on top." Now, to understand why Jamaica suffered from such a catastrophic earthquake, you might find it easier to imagine when you learn that Jamaica sits on the same microplate as the island known at the time as Hispaniola. Hispaniola is now Haiti to the west and the Dominican Republic on its eastern half. On January 12th, 2010, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck the country of Haiti, with the epicenter focused just to the west of the capital city of Port-au-Prince. Haiti is not a wealthy country by a long shot, and its infrastructure and housing simply couldn't stand up to a 7.0 earthquake. The quake caused around $8 billion in damages and left at least 100,000 people deceased, with government estimates of the dead going as high as 316,000 victims. But that's an entire episode or two in and of itself. The 2010 Haitian earthquake it's going to be a really complicated episode when I get to it one of these days. I have another earthquake coming up, so it's earthquake time, I guess. But what the thing about the Haitian earthquake, if you don't know a lot about it, is that not only was it a very destructive earthquake, but also there were a lot of people who took advantage of the situation, not just in terms of criminals in Haiti who were taking advantage of, people who were injured or, things like that, but also people who decided to raise money for Haiti and then didn't spend it on Haiti. Or, some of them were famous. If we start getting into that, now's not the time. Like I said, the point is that major earthquakes occur in that region all the time, and have done so going back several centuries. It's seismic activity in that area. There's a lot of it in that area of the Caribbean. Look at the eruption of Mount Pele that we did an episode of. That is a part of that. The microplate, which Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic all border or straddle, is the Gonave microplate, shaped like a crudely drawn rectangle. The southern fault of that microplate goes through Jamaica, with the Walton Fault Zone to the west and the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault Zone to the east, running through the lower part of Haiti. So that's the part that is, that caused that particular earthquake. And then this particular earthquake is those two fault lines actually running right underneath Jamaica, making earthquakes a regular occurrence over the course of the 2 centuries since Columbus first set foot in the West Indies before this particular earthquake happened. When the Spanish were in charge of the island, they responded to Jamaica's seismic habits by building accordingly, like I described. They built low to the ground and deep into solid earth, good solid foundations. A sandy patch like the area in which Port Royal was located would have been a no-go area. But when the British took over, they had less incentive to build with quakes in mind. They were kind of dismissive about the whole thing, like I said. They didn't have a century and a half of experience with Jamaica's near clockwork expectations for serious earthquakes, nor did they go through quite as many as Spanish colonizers had. The thing is that the earthquakes in Jamaica, you can't time an earthquake. You just can't. You can't say like, oh, we're going to have an earthquake next week. We're going to have an earthquake in a year or two, anything like that. But with Jamaica, it was pretty much a regular occurrence. Every couple of years, every, 4 or 5 years, something along those lines, you were getting a pretty big earthquake. And the Spanish learned to expect that. But the British had only been there for a good less than 40 years in terms of running the island. And so they really didn't have that kind of experience. There had only been 2 serious earthquakes on the island over the course of English occupation. And even then, not in a full 8 years. The last really serious one had been 8 years prior. And they had that one 4 years earlier, but it really wasn't that much. Like there were maybe little quakes, but nothing really that made them go, this is a bad place. And this is, something where something serious is going to happen. The quake which struck Jamaica and destroyed much of Port Royal in 1692 was estimated to be a 7.5 on the Richter scale. It was pretty much centered not by Port Royal, but like up more, toward the northern part of the island, a little more. But that was where it took a lot of the damage, was in Port Royal. Given the size of the earthquakes which caused the Boxing Day and Asian tsunamis of 2004 and 2011, which were like 9.0 and 9.2 to 9.4 if was the Boxing Day tsunami, if I remember correctly, and the Asian tsunami is 9.1. I know that because that's the one that I'm working on. 7.5 might not sound so bad. And Port Royal wasn't full of buildings the size of Thailand's luxury hotels or northern Japan's office complexes. And a thing that we're going to get into when I do those episodes on the Asian tsunamis, the Japan tsunami and earthquake in 2011, is that Japan is really, really, really prepared for earthquakes. And so with a lot of these buildings or a lot of these areas, even if you're building in an area where a tsunami might occur, there are tsunami evacuation zones all over the place. Every school, they have plastic helmets so that when an earthquake happens, the kids put on their helmets and then they go outside or they go to wherever it is that they need to wait to, evacuate and check and make sure that everybody's okay. Like all of that. They are very prepared. They build buildings that stand. So when an earthquake hits that does the sort of damage that happened in 2011, that is a serious earthquake. That is a very serious earthquake. A 7.5 hitting Jamaica at a time when that sort of building wasn't taking place, I mean, it's lucky it didn't wipe the island flat. The Port Royal of today, which is a small town, it's lots of empty spaces, is much different from the cramped city crammed onto a spit of land just off the main island of Jamaica. So, I mean, at the time, you had all of these buildings and all of these people crammed into this spot. And that's not exactly always going to be the safest place to be in an earthquake if it's very serious, particularly when you have these buildings that don't have foundations and they are, they're right by the wharf and they are, they're not built the way that the ones that the Spanish colonizers built that, hold firm and are low to the ground. Port Royal is essentially a large patch of sand, and when the earthquake struck it, it liquefied beneath a huge section of the city. When liquefaction occurs due to an earthquake, it means land like that underneath Port Royal, coarse, loose, and wet, flows more like a river than the solid earth it might be treated as. It doesn't mean that it turns into water and goes. It just acts like water. Port Royal's northern side slid underneath the harbor as the ground underneath it slid away, as though freshly whipped cake batter. If you've ever poured cake batter out into the pan, it just flowed just like that. So the location chosen on which to build Port Royal when more solid ground was within sight across the harbor was the perfect spot if one wanted the town to disappear one day just as quickly as it had risen out of the sand. Understandably, while Port Royal received the largest amount of damage from the earthquake, the rest of Jamaica felt the earth's rage as well. Heath speaks of, in his letters of what happened, he goes on to say that, the houses, people, trees, in lieu of which afterwards appeared great pools of water, which when dried up left nothing but sand without any mark that ever tree or plant had been thereon. End quote. He theorizes that given the, quote, greatest of violences, unquote, were among the mountainous region up north, the quake's center could be found there. And that was true. It was, more that way. It wasn't closer to Port Royal, but that is, a pretty good guess to make, given everything that he writes about. The rebuilding of Port Royal, or at least an attempt to do so, began almost immediately after the earthquake. Even with half the town underwater, Port Royal could still be restored to somewhat of its former glory, tarnished or not. Then came 1703. That year, a fierce fire tore through the city, leaving it once again in ruins. Yet, despite the quake and the tsunami and the fire, one after another, people weren't about to give up on Port Royal. An 1840 artistic rendition of Port Royal as it stood as of that year shows a considerably shrunken version of what stood 150 years earlier, with far fewer streets and buildings taking up the northern half of what was left of that patch of land. Port Royal would continue to be the target of other natural disasters as the centuries went on. One earthquake in 1907 would cause a one-story brick building, the Royal Artillery House for the Victoria Battery, to slump down into the sand, leaving the structure tilting upward at about a 35-degree angle or so. It is this brick building. It's about the size and shape of a small trailer, and basically it's like, you're standing at the front door of this trailer, which is on one side of the trailer, and the back half of the trailer has sunk into the ground. And so now it's kind of tilting upward toward you. So if you open that front door and you go inside, you're going to be sliding downward. That's what's the angle that you're talking about here. The building, now nicknamed the Giddy House, still stands, or more aptly, tilts, to this day. Much like the 1907 quake, natural disasters would continue to strike Port Royal. The ground would shake and part of it would fall. A hurricane would hit head on, and yet another piece of the town would be shaved away. Over and over and over again, the earth would target Port Royal, driving people away from the sketchy piece of land and onto the more sturdy land of Kingston, just past the Sandbar Road and on the main island. Now, the closest many people ever get to Port Royal is landing at the airport between it and Kingston on the Palisados Road, or when stepping off a cruise ship onto the huge dock on the north side of Port Royal. They built that dock there because I presume, it is a pretty good location to build a cruise ship dock. But they had some trouble placing it, as we will see. If you go on Google Street View and wander around modern-day Port Royal, you will find a simple fishing village with beautiful weather and gorgeous views from the seaside. You might almost think that there was nothing special about it if it weren't for the remains of several forts and the Royal Naval Hospital on the northern side of town, which isn't working as a hospital, but I believe it's working as more of a historical building. It looks like it's abandoned, and so it kind of has that vibe to it. And just off the beach near the hospital, the sunken sections of Port Royal remain below the water. In fact, if you look up Port Royal on Apple Maps and look at the satellite photos of the water on the northern side, you can see the faint hint of cobblestone streets and fallen buildings below the harbor. It's not in detail, obviously, but you can definitely tell that there is something below that water. That maybe, you might think that it's a reef or something along those lines, a shipwreck maybe, but that's the city. That is what used to be Port Royal. Explorer Bob Marks and others like him have excavated the site of the sunken sections of the city, bringing up not just dishes and utensils from the time of the earthquake, but indigenous Arawak artifacts from the original residents of Jamaica. Marks also brought up multiple pieces of weaponry held in the forts which sank, and medical equipment like a urethral injection device meant to treat venereal disease. If I'm remembering correctly, now this is in the Undercover Cities episode, what you see is it looks like a syringe, but with a wider, obviously not a needle at the end, but like a pipette at the end, and it's metal. And apparently they thought it was for baking, for putting cream into baked goods. But then they tested the interior and they realized it was for treating STDs, and they would put, like I said, if I'm remembering correctly, lime and molasses in it. So I don't know. Yeah, you know where they're injecting it. Let's put it that way. And I don't know how that's going to work out, but I hope it worked for everybody that it was injected into. Oh God. Um, If you're exploring and excavating a sunken pirate town, what anyone wants to find more than anything is literal pirate treasure. And Marks found out as well a wooden chest containing 3,000 silver pieces kept in pristine condition by the ocean water. Now, Marks did this in the 60s. And since then, a lot of those pieces have like disappeared. I think it's like the Institute of Jamaica or the Museum of Jamaica, something along those lines, has those pieces, a lot of them, and they are really well maintained in terms of being able to see the writing and the imprint on them. Part of the exploration of the sunken part of the city was due to the fact that they wanted to build that cruise ship dock, and they wanted to build it there, and it was kind of like, okay, well, we're gonna have to like explore that area. So you had people like Bob Marks and during the 80s the Port Royal Project, who went down and explored the city underneath the water. Bob Marks explored nearer to where the hospital is, and then the Port Royal Project focused more a little bit more to the east. In particular, the busy intersection of Lime and Queen Streets, where liquefaction of the land due to the earthquake lowered the buildings there almost in one piece. The project located 8 full buildings below the harbor, shining a light on the everyday life of Port Royal in 1692. There was a lot of there were a lot of things that they found in there. During one of those underwater explorations not far from Fort James, where that would have been, searchers located a pocket watch amongst the remains of Old Port Royal. This pocket watch, made by Frenchman Paul Blondel about 6 years prior to the earthquake, which I don't know much about making watches other than Aldous Hodge makes them, and they're very pretty. I know the name Paul Blondel had been stopped for all time at 11:43 a.m. So when you read these accounts of when this happened, they're not that precise, but having that watch gave a precise time as to when that earthquake occurred. Its hands were forever frozen at the moment when the earthquake presumably ended the life of its owner and the lives of thousands of others on the island of Jamaica that horrifying day. Yay, I finally got an episode done. No, don't mind me. I don't know about the rest of you, but life is really hard right now. So it has been a lot of a struggle to get things out. So thank you for being patient with me for working on this. I'm going to try to get the next few episodes out. I'm trying to get a lot of episodes out in May so that I can fix my car finally. And so that is going to be, I've got a few episodes that I've got started and that I can get worked on, and hopefully get them done very quickly. Fingers crossed. We'll see how it goes. But again, if you want to donate, I'm going to put the GoFundMe for my car in the notes of this episode. You know, if you want to help out, you don't have to, but thank you if you do. So yeah, Port Royal, full of pirates. I said I wasn't going to do a pirate voice, but I couldn't help myself. Yeah, it definitely didn't look like in the movie. That's in St. Vincent. St. Vincent? I don't know. But that's where they filmed it for the movie. Port Royal, I mean, when you look at Port Royal on, Google Street View and you walk around, it seems like it might be a nice enough town. I don't know if it's one of those towns where, for a small town, it looks cute. And then, you find out later that, it's full of, a bunch of people who, maybe don't want to go there or, that sort of thing. That's the thing about small towns, I say, as somebody from a small town, is that you will think that a small town looks cute and quaint. And then you will find out, oh, yeah, it's got a huge drug problem. or, yeah, there's a bunch of kids who just commit a bunch of crimes all the time. It's the just annoying thing about living in small towns. There's so many things about small towns that are annoying, like having no public transportation. That's maybe my biggest annoyance right now. I would really like a metro system so much. I want a subway so much. But anyway, so how is everybody? I'm okay. I could be better. I could have my car fixed, but I don't have my car fixed, so I'll worry about that another time. If you haven't, go see Sinners. Sinners is amazing. If you are iffy about horror. It's mostly blood and gore, but if you can handle that, you should be okay. There's occasionally a jump scare, things like that, but everything about it, perfect. Perfect. I am a huge fan of Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan movies, the two of them working together, like Fruitvale Station, Creed, Black Panther, just keep giving them to me, inject them straight into my veins. And that is exactly what I like about Sinners. That's one of them. Ruth Carter did the costumes for the movie, who she won an Oscar for doing the costumes for Black Panther, which in detail are amazing. I keep going back and looking at them, and I'm a little bit of a costume geek in terms of like looking at the artistry and making these costumes, and her work on Black Panther is to die for. So the outfits that she made for the movie are just so good. Every actor in it, fantastic. Delroy Lindo. You get to see Buddy Guy. You have to understand, I love old blues and jazz and big band, like all of that music from like before the 1950s. Like we're talking, all of the big band and jazz, but also all the old blues, Robert Johnson, all of that. That's right up my alley. So this movie is absolutely amazing. There's one thing I wanted to bring up that is related to the podcast, because there's a reason I was talking about this other than the fact that I think everybody involved deserves an Oscar. Or at least an Oscar nomination. Come on, man. Please just give Michael B. Jordan an Oscar nomination. Finally. For once. Jeez. It's the one thing that I want. Please. But anyway, you might not remember because this was a while ago, but I did an episode early in the podcast. I think it was episode 10, if I'm remembering correctly, on the Rhythm Club Fire. And for those of you who didn't listen all the way back then, the movie is set in 1932 in Mississippi, Clarksdale. Now, in the Rhythm Club Fire, this happened in Natchez in 1940, so 8 years later. There is a lot of things in the movie that are really interesting and really well handled, like, the segregation and the way that society in that area of the South dealt with race, and how you dealt with other people depending on of race, and the one drop rule, and like all of this sort of stuff. And it's reflective of what happened with the Rhythm Club Fire, especially in terms of, there is one scene in the movie, one sequence. And if I say that scene, anybody who has seen that movie already will know what I'm talking about. There is a sequence in that movie that is strange and hypnotic and beautiful and just amazing. And